If you collapsed in a medieval village during a plague outbreak, there was a real chance you would wake up underground, not because anyone hated you, because nobody could tell the difference between a body shutting down and a body already gone. This fear had a name that outlived the people who felt it: taphophobia, the fear of being buried alive. It wasn't a fringe worry. During major plague waves in medieval and early modern Europe, it shaped how families said goodbye, how gravediggers worked, and how entire towns understood death itself. That fear had a simple, unsettling root: medicine that couldn't actually measure life. Physicians of the time had no reliable way to detect a faint pulse or shallow breath. A held mirror, a feather near the lips, a hand pressed to the chest. These were the only tools available, and none of them worked well on a person in a deep coma, a severe fever, or the final stages of plague, when the body could grow cold, and still while a person remained technically alive. Then plague turned that uncertainty into something far more dangerous. When the Black Death tore through Europe in the 14th century, some towns lost so many people so quickly that burial became a race against decay and disease, not a careful ritual. Historians describe mass graves called plague pits, dug on the edges of towns, where bodies were laid in quickly to limit the spread of what people believed was a poisoned, corrupting air. Under that kind of pressure, corners got cut, and the results could be haunting. A person deep in fever sleep, barely breathing, could be mistaken for dead by an exhausted family or an overwhelmed burial crew working through the night. Some historical accounts describe bodies found afterward in positions suggesting movement in the grave. Though scholars note many of these stories were also shaped later by fear and folklore, and not every account can be verified as truth rather than legend. What is well documented, though, is how deeply this fear reshaped burial customs across Europe. In parts of the continent, people began attaching small bells to strings that ran from a coffin up to the surface, so that if someone woke underground, they could ring for help. Watchmen were sometimes assigned to graveyards, specifically to listen for these bells through the night. This is where the phrase, "saved by the bell," is popularly said to come from, though most historians actually trace its origin to boxing rather than burial. Still, the belief that it began in graveyards spread so widely that many people repeat it as fact today, a small sign of just how deep this fear sank into everyday culture. In parts of Germany, that same anxiety gave rise to waiting mortuaries, where bodies were kept above ground in special holding rooms for days before burial, sometimes with strings tied to their fingers connected to bells, so that any flicker of life would be caught before the ground closed over them for good. But village medicine didn't just fail to detect life. It often misread the signs of disease as the signs of death. Certain illnesses could slow breathing to almost nothing, drop body temperature, and leave a person rigid and unresponsive for hours. To a family with no formal medical training and no time to spare, given the fear of contagion, that stillness looked final. And fear of contagion made the pressure worse, not better. During outbreaks, people believed that lingering near the sick or the dead invited the same fate. Bodies, and sometimes people who only appeared to be bodies, needed to be removed from the home quickly. Speed was treated as safety, even when it cost the one thing that couldn't be undone. Religious belief deepened the danger further. In many medieval communities, sickness itself was seen as a sign of divine judgment or a test of faith. Some believed suffering was meant to be endured rather than fought, which meant a person in the grip of a severe fever might be treated as already surrendered to their fate, rather than as someone who might still recover. Even the medicine meant to help could make matters worse. Village healers, working from a system called humoral medicine, believed the body was governed by 4 fluids: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, and that illness meant these fluids had fallen out of balance. Treatments like bloodletting, purging, and sweating out fevers could leave a patient weaker and stiller than the disease alone, blurring the line between very sick and dead even further. Archaeology has since given this old fear a quieter kind of confirmation. Skeletal evidence from plague-era mass graves shows just how quickly, and in what numbers, bodies were placed together, consistent with historical accounts of burial systems overwhelmed faster than any careful confirmation of death could keep up with. By the 18th and 19th centuries, this fear had grown organized enough to produce actual inventions: Patents were filed across Europe and America for what became known as safety coffins, fitted with air tubes, glass viewing panels, or cords connected to bells and flags above ground, all built for the same possibility that had haunted villages for centuries, waking up below the surface. A small number of documented cases exist of people being revived after appearing dead, and that handful of real incidents was enough to keep the fear alive for generations. This was never pure superstition. It was a fear built on genuine gaps in medical knowledge, gaps that took centuries of science to finally close. Doctors eventually developed better tools. The stethoscope, reliable pulse measurement, and a real understanding of the difference between deep unconsciousness and death. These tools didn't just save lives in the moment. They slowly erased one of the oldest fears a person could carry into their final illness. But for centuries before that, the fear was rational given what people actually knew. A village didn't fail its sick out of cruelty. It failed them because a fever could look exactly like death, because the ground needed to close quickly during an outbreak, and because nobody yet had the tools to look closer. Today, we take for granted that a hospital monitor can tell the difference between a slowed heartbeat and a stopped one. That certainty is new. For most of human history, the line between sick and gone was a guess made under pressure by people doing their best with almost nothing to go on. The next time you catch your own pulse in a quiet room, remember that for most of history, that same quiet moment could have marked the difference between a life continuing and a life ending in the dark, underground, with no one left to hear you.